Hi, my name is Louise Schoenstock and I look after books for Google Play. I'm really delighted to be working with the Brisbane Writers' Festival this year to present a series of Hangouts on air with attending authors. And we're very excited that one of the authors taking part today is Chris Flynn. Now, Chris Flynn has been immersed in the world of writing for many years. He's the books editor at the Big Issue and the fiction consultant at the Australian Book Review. He's a former publisher of Torpedo magazine. He writes for The Age, The Australian, The Paris Review, ABC Radio National, and edited issue 41 of McSweeney's, which was partly devoted to Indigenous Australian fiction. So someone who has been immersed in books for such a long time is very brave to write his own novel, and he has. He's written A Tiger in Eden, which I absolutely loved, and the press has really enjoyed as well. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
No problem. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I do have to ask, after spending years of reviewing other people's books, was it terrifying to publish your own?
No, actually it wasn't. I've got quite a thick skin, and writers generally don't. I think they're very, very sensitive about criticism of their work, but I actually quite like. I quite enjoyed the few negative reviews that I got. The masochist in me almost wishes that I had a few more negative ones, because I actually felt like I learned a little bit from those. The reviewing thing is a whole sort of can of worms in Australia, particularly because everyone's so nice to each other, and a lot of reviewers know the writers or will bump into them at festivals and so on. So people are very cautious, I think, sometimes about being totally honest about what they think about books. So I like a bit of honesty, and I did quite enjoy the negative reviews. Maybe I'm just a masochist.
And so have you written a fair share of negative reviews yourself in your time?
Oh, I have a little bit in recent years, so I've probably made a few enemies. But you have to be honest. You know, I think criticism in Australia needs a bit more honesty. You know, I can understand we're a relatively small community, and people are a bit nervous about the impact a negative review that they write might have on their own future. Like, it could easily have been the case that some of the negative reviews that I wrote might have influenced people when they read my manuscript and deciding not to publish it, for example. But it worked out well for me, and I don't think I stepped in too many toes.
As a reviewer, what do you think are the most important things in a book? What makes a good or a great book stand out for you?
Yeah, well, I mostly review fiction, and I read a lot of fiction. Last year I read 98 books, and the year before I read 96 books. And I only know this because I started keeping a list for the first time in my life. So I've been keeping a little spreadsheet just so I can keep track of the books that I read. So I didn't even realize that I was reading that much. And so because when you read that much, there are things that become annoying quite quickly. And so I tend to enjoy a little bit of originality whenever I see it. I think it's important for books to be well researched, but to have a really distinctive voice as well. An editor at Fourth Estate in the UK told me a few years ago something that really made me think very differently about writing, and he said that when all the manuscripts arrive on his desk, if the manuscript has a really compelling voice, then he can almost forgive everything else about it, because everything else can be fixed. And that sort of shocked me a little bit, but then I realized that a lot of the books that I had enjoyed did have a very sort of strong narrative voice in them, and it's something I guess I tried to do with my own novel. In fact, my novel is pretty much all voice, really.
Yeah, we were talking about that just before we started. You've written your novel in a Northern Irish accent, which I just loved. I felt like it really set the tone beautifully, and I knew Billy, or Will, intimately because of that. I understood him better. How was it writing in an accent?
It's fairly strange process. The book was never written in that accent initially. It went through quite a lot of iterations over the years, and it was only whenever I finally had pretty much given up hope on it, and that I decided to write it in the first person in his voice. It was the first time I had done that in all the different drafts, and it became a bit of a sort of comedy performance almost, because I would sit down, write a few lines, and then stand up and walk around the room pretending to be him, doing a bit of method acting, and say the lines and make myself laugh, and then realize, okay, he wouldn't have said it just like that. He probably would have said it more like this. But the more I did that, the more I was able to slip in and out of the character whenever I was writing, and it became this almost like how I imagine an actor would be if they were appearing on the stage, 5 nights a week, playing the same role. During the day they're someone else, but then when they go on stage they assume that persona. And I kind of did that whenever I was writing it, and that seemed to make it a bit easier to do, but it's a bit of a strange character to be inhabiting. There was a little bit of bleed into my normal life, I will admit, in terms of the language and the kind of things that he says. I find myself occasionally using one of his phrases. And my editor, who's from Tasmania, he cursed me because he ended up doing something very similar and saying things to his wife that she found a little bit shocking. Where did you get that from?
Did you go as far as putting a "My Surrender" tattoo on across your chest?
No. I have decided against the "No Surrender" tattoo. I don't think that's a good idea, really.
We should talk a little bit more about your book, because I love the fact that you dropped a loyalist hard man into backpacking Thailand in the 1990s, where house music was all the rage and some good drugs were available, and he's on the run, and he's trying to figure out his life, really, after so much violence and nightmares and so forth. What an extraordinary thing to do, dropping a hard man into Thailand. What made you think of doing something like that?
Oh, it's kind of because I sort of met guys like that who were in that situation. Whenever I was growing up, you would often hear about tough guys who they would just vanish one day and they'd be gone, and you would hear that they had to leave the country because they'd got into trouble either with the law or with their own organizations. And they would abscond and go off to somewhere in Asia or sometimes Australia. That was the first time I'd ever heard the word Australia as a kid, was in that context, that there would be these scary guys who had grown up in this life of sort of crazy sectarian violence and not knowing anything else, who had to leave and could never come back home again. And I always remembered that, and I thought that would be a very strange situation. Also, when you're in places like Thailand and on the backpacker scene, you meet so many people, but you don't really know much about them. You don't really know what their background is, and you're kind of trusting. You just assume that everyone's in the same sort of mindset as you, but there could be monsters lurking within there. And I like the idea of having this monstrous guy stuck in this quite hedonistic place where at first he thinks it's great, but as the book begins, he's been there for about a year, and it's starting to wear on him because he knows he's stuck there. He can't actually do anything else, and he doesn't really know what he's going to do with himself. He can never go back to the life he had, and so he doesn't really know how to move on. So it's a sort of interesting period in people's lives, when, particularly in their mid-20s, when they're trying to decide what they want to do with themselves. And for him, it's that extra element, because the only thing he's ever known is beating people up, and suddenly he beats people up still in the book, but he has to try and think of something else to do with himself.
Yeah, I like the way that the book felt like an amble through that time, and he formed these really intense relationships with people who were only in his life for maybe a couple of weeks, but they profoundly affected his journey, really, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's one of the secrets behind the book, is that idea that he's stuck there, but no one else is stuck there. It's a real place of transience for people. They come, they spend a few weeks partying it up, and then they leave. And he is exposed to these people whom he would never have met otherwise, and who live, all over the world. And this is the first time he's hearing about things, as he's lived quite a sheltered life in many ways. So this is where he is learning about the fact that there are books, that you can read books. It never occurred to him to read books before, but he's got bugger all else to do. He's hanging out on the beach, so of course he starts to read the books that the backpackers are carrying, and he learns a little bit about food, and about a bit about religion, and a bit about quite a lot about love, and it never really occurred to him to explore these things before, but there he can explore them, because there's no limits to those sort of things when you're there.
It's still with me. Billy is running around in my head And he does make me vaguely want to get a tattoo, actually, because despite his horrendous background and some of the awful things he continues to do, you can't help but sort of not pity him, but you want him to succeed in this journey that he's going on, to sort of leave behind that appalling past, which he didn't really have a choice about, and find something.
Right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's quite a nice guy hiding in there, but that guy, that young man, never really had a chance to blossom, because of the environment that he grew up in, where he was very much channeled into a certain type of life. So I guess that's the tricky thing with a protagonist like that, that has got a bit of a horrendous past, and maybe behaves quite sort of aggressively and roughly, and treats everyone with a bit of like he's constantly wanting to get into a bit of argy-bargy, and he kind of likes that because he never really known anything else. But not everyone. Whenever you meet people that seem bad on the surface, no one is all bad. Everyone has a bit of good in them. I firmly believe that, and everyone who is good has a bit of bad in them, and so he's that sort of tricky protagonist, because at times you probably really dislike him, but at other times you feel desperately sorry for him, and you want him to improve or to become something else, and yeah, so that worked out quite well, I think, in the end.
I thought it was quite interesting also the women that he meets and generally has sex with. They're all sort of good middle-class girls from all over the world who are just attracted to that sense of danger about him, although they're not even really sure what it is because he hasn't told them.
Yeah, that's right. He's got that air about him of just because he's physically quite large, and he's got the scary tattoos, and people necessarily don't understand what the tattoos mean, but there's certainly that idea that something has happened with this guy in the past, and of course he is carrying some very sort of dark secrets within him. But yeah, I wanted him to learn a lot from the women, and because it's kind of his encounters with women that change him as a young man, that make him into a better guy, or open up the possibility of him being a better man, because he dearly loves women, and he does have sex with all the women he meets. Although if you notice, the sex is always initiated by the women in every sex scene in the book, because they are attracted to him. He's this sort of scary-looking guy, but I think there's this scene where he's with one girl, and she says to him, "Nothing would ever happen to me whenever I'm with you," and he's like, "That's right." And so there's a total air of this guy can really handle himself. I think he would be the ultimate protector, because he loves women so much, and he is physically very strong, and has obviously done some crazy stuff in the past. But having said that, some people have been a bit uncomfortable with the character, and in terms of that, particularly men, actually, which is quite interesting. A lot of guys haven't really identified very much with the character.
Maybe women just fall in love with him a little bit.
I think maybe there is a little bit of that, yeah. And guys maybe feel a bit threatened by him. He's the sort of guy that they would dread to meet, because he's funny, and he's not stupid. He's not particularly smart either, but he's got a bit of wit, and he's curious about the world. Plus, he's also really physically strong. So yeah, maybe he seems like a bit of a threatening character for a lot of guys.
So you've taken a loyalist hardman and dropped him in Thailand. How on earth can you top that? What's going to come next?
Oh, that's a good question, isn't it? Well, this was actually the 5th book that I attempted, but the other 4 weren't very good, or got rejected by publishers. So I've been revisiting one of those. I think 3 of them are pretty bad, but I've been revisiting one of those, and so the next book is almost finished, actually, and but it will be very different indeed. A few people have asked me about what happens to Billy at the end. I mean, we can't obviously give away the ending of the book, but I will say that the ending has been a little bit controversial in some quarters. Some people don't like the ending, mainly because I wanted the ending to be a beginning almost. But people have asked me what happens to Billy after this, and it didn't really occur to me until people asked me that but all these other drafts I'd written, I actually have his whole life planned out. And so I know what happens to him right up until he's in his 40s. So I actually could jump forward 5 years and pick it up from there, with him moving on to the next stage of his life. But I don't know if I'll do that immediately. I might do that eventually if it becomes a movie or something and suddenly everyone likes it.
I like the ending. I think a lot of books really struggle with endings. It's too neat, or it's like they run out of puff or something. I like the fact that it was, you know, a beginning and an ending at the same time. I felt really satisfied with that ending. It didn't feel like you were just tying it up neatly. It felt good.
Well, that's good, because it's a bit ambiguous, the ending. It's you're not quite sure necessarily what's going to happen next for him. But I mean, particularly publishers in America, when we've been trying to sell the rights there, they have balked a little bit at that ending and said that they wanted a more retributive ending, where he goes out in a hail of gunfire, and maybe that says a little bit more about American publishers and American culture than it does about the weakness of my ending, perhaps.
I wanted to talk a little bit about McSweeney, because you edited issue 41, which was partly devoted to Indigenous writing. What was that like? How did you find the writers?
But yeah, I mean, that was McSweeney's have done little suites of non-American writing a few times now. They did a whole did part of an issue dedicated to Kenyan writing, part of an issue dedicated to Norwegian, one dedicated to Icelandic fiction. And I've known those guys for a few years, and a lot of the Australian short fiction that I was enjoying in recent years happened to be written by Indigenous writers, and I thought they seemed to be a bit at the cutting edge of, particularly of the way they use language in short fiction. And I knew a lot of those writers, and so I just proposed it to McSweeney's. I said, maybe this is a good time for an issue sort of partly dedicated to Indigenous fiction. I think you guys might like this. And so I just put out the call for submissions, got a bunch of submissions, and selected some, sent them to McSweeney's, and they loved them. So it all happened quite sort of quickly, and that issue has just come out. So there's 4 Indigenous authors in that issue. It's the first time Australian fiction has been featured in McSweeney's, which is pretty much the most popular fiction quarterly in the world. So that's really awesome.
And you unearthed at least one brand new writer, sort of an undiscovered, didn't you?
Well, her name is Ellen van Neerven Curry, and she lives in Brisbane, where I am today. And she's a recent graduate, and but she's just a tremendous writer. So this is her first. I think it's her first published story. So quite a coup for her to be published in McSweeney's with your first story. But she's got a very promising future. I'm sure she's going to be a very well-known author in Australia.
Fantastic. As a book reviewer as well, I wanted to go back to your book reviewing. If you're reading 98 books a year, and I've just figured out that I'm probably doing something quite similar. I just don't review books. I choose where they go on the store. But you do read a lot, and for me, when I read a brilliant book, it gives me goosebumps. What sort of books has sort of given you your version of goosebumps recently that you've sort of pressed into people's hands?
Yeah, after getting into I've always been into short stories, but there hasn't been a lot of great short story collections out in the last year for me. But I'm getting back into that now. I've just read Junot Diaz's new book. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Brief, Wondrous Life, Oscar Wilde. I think that's what it's called. And he's got a new book of short stories out called This Is How You Lose Her, and it's following one of his characters who's already appeared in his books, and it's about all the failed relationships that he's had and how he has lost all of his girlfriends. So they're all really sort of cute short stories based on messed up relationships. But he's from the Dominican Republic and lives in the US, so they're from the point of view of people in that community. So it's got this awesome sort of street Spanish language. Again, I love anything that plays around with language and pushes English language to its limits. Where when you're reading this book, some of the words you don't understand what they are, and there's no glossary or anything, so you have to try and work it out from the context, or else go and look it up. But I quite like being made to work a little bit like that. I don't really like it whenever books are lazy and you're just like flicking through, not really that engaged. I like something that challenges me a little bit as a reader.
We were just talking a little bit earlier about Urban Welsh's new book and the fact that he's written in multiple kind of voices.
think there's about 12 different voices in it. It's called Skag Boys, and it's a sequel to Trainspotting. And so it's got all these different regional Scottish accents, not just one accent, and an English accent, and I was going to tell you about this before, but I forgot, because we were talking about how that we don't learn to write in accents, we learn to write in proper English. And Irving Welsh actually plays around with this notion in Skag Boys, because Mark Renton, who was played by Ewan McGregor in Trainspotting, he's in the book again, but he's a university student in the book because it's set prior to Trainspotting, and so he's getting a very formal education. And so the passages written in his voice are written in this really vernacular Scottish voice, but then there are passages of him writing stuff down, and when he writes things down, they're in perfect Queen's English. But it annoys him. It annoys him that they are. And so Renton himself scratches out words in this perfect Queen's English and writes in the phonetic Scottish versions of the words, because he feels embarrassed by the fact that he's got an education and that he's cleaning up his language. I thought that was really interesting.
Well, you'll have to keep playing with language in the way that you're doing in your next book. I really hope so, because there aren't enough books written in, I think, in that kind of really clear voice. You also you've got Nick Earls as one of your fans. So now that you are a writer and attending festivals instead of interviewing things, are you finding that well different, or is it similar to what it was when you were a book reviewer? Well, still are a book reviewer.
Well, it's a little bit different in that I'm expected to answer questions rather than ask them, and that's a little bit odd. I don't mind, because I'm quite used to doing interviews, so I know how it all works. It is a little bit strange whenever people come up to me and suddenly know who I am, or have read some of my work. That takes a little bit of getting used to, I must admit. But I don't mind it. I saw Nick Earls before, and I didn't get the chance to say hello because he was rushed off somewhere. But if I see him again today, I'll go and say hello, because he seems to be a bit of a fan of mine. So that's quite nice.
He's quite. I mean, he's also someone who has a really fantastic Australian voice. And I remember living in London in the early '90s and reading Zigzag Street and just crying myself silly because it was home and it was done so well. So it's nice. It's nice to run into people like that.
Nick's actually from Northern Ireland as well. So he's from the same part of the world as me. That's so maybe that's why he is a fan of the book, because it turns out he is from this little small holiday town where my mum and dad used to take me to a caravan park whenever I was a kid. So, I mean, Nick's older than me, but it's kind of odd to think that he came out of this quirky little caravan town park.
And you call Melbourne home now?
Yeah, I've been there for 12 or 13 years, I guess now. A bit unexpected. I didn't really think I would like Australia when I first came here, but I've ended up staying, and I've got my Australian citizenship and everything now.
Fantastic. Well, it has been absolutely lovely to talk to you today, Chris. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us and to discuss your really fantastic book. I just loved it, A Tiger in Eden, which is available on Google Play now. Enjoy the rest of the Brisbane Writers Festival, and I look forward to reading book number 2.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Great. Take care.
Bye.